Nicole Rogers grew up in a small town where her life revolved around the pool from an early age. She began swimming at the age of 5. Her parents, recognizing their daughter's talent, supported her passion by taking her to all her practices and competitions. When Nicole turned 10, she was noticed by the coach of a local sports club who offered her the chance to train professionally. Still a teenager, Nicole became one of the best swimmers in her age group at the state level. Among her coaches was Mr. James Harrison, an experienced and respected mentor who took Nicole under his wing. But just when it seemed her dreams were beginning to come true, fate decided to test her resilience. One evening after practice, Mr. Harrison asked Nicole to stay behind. He said he wanted to discuss her progress and future plans. After everyone else had left, Mr. Harrison began the conversation with praise, talking about her outstanding achievements and potential. However, the conversation soon took a different turn. Mr. Harrison began talking about how she needed to relax and trust her mentors. He started touching her hand and shoulder, which made Nicole feel slightly uneasy. She tried to move away, but the coach persisted. At one point, he leaned in closer and attempted to kiss her. Nicole froze in horror. Her body stiffened and she couldn't move. Nicole tried to resist, but her strength was leaving her. She felt helpless and trapped in this nightmare. What happened next, Nicole would remember for the rest of her life. This moment changed her forever. When it was over, Mr. Harrison told her to stay silent and threatened that if she told anyone, her career would be ruined. From that day on, Nicole began to avoid the pool. Soon, she stopped training altogether and severed all ties with her former life. Her dreams of a sports career were shattered, leaving her in deep depression. Several years later, after graduating from college, Nicole decided to try returning to sports, but in a different role. She took a job as a coach for children at a local sports school. Nicole worked under Carl Williams, an experienced coach who had managed the facility for many years. Carl immediately noticed the new employee. Initially, their relationship was purely professional. However, over time, Carl began to show increasing interest in Nicole. He invited her to lunch, offered to give her a ride home after work, and tried to spend more time with her. Nicole did not like his advances, but she tried to be polite and maintain her distance. Her past experience had left a deep scar, and she did not want to relive that nightmare. One evening after practice, Carl again offered to drive her home. Nicole reluctantly agreed. However, at some point, Carl suddenly stopped the car. He turned to her and began asking why she was rejecting him. His voice grew increasingly insistent, and Nicole felt trapped. At one moment when Carl tried to hug her, Nicole was abruptly reminded of that horrible evening with Mr. Harrison. Her body instinctively tensed, and a long-suppressed aggression awoke within her. Without realizing what she was doing, Nicole grabbed Carl by the neck. She was unaware of how her hands, trained by years of swimming, tightened around him. After a few minutes, his body went limp, and he stopped moving. Panicked, she bolted from the car and ran home. The next day, Carl's body was found in his car. The police began an investigation, but there were few clues. Nicole continued working at the sports school, trying to act as usual. However, she felt a strange sense of relief and even satisfaction from having protected herself. A few weeks later, Nicole decided she needed to clear her mind and went for a run. The early morning seemed like the perfect time. The streets were empty, and she could be alone with her thoughts. During her run, she stopped at a small bench in the park to rest. At that moment, a drunken man approached and began making lewd comments and inappropriate advances. Nicole felt a surge of rage rising within her. Her body tensed, and she could no longer control herself. In a fit of anger, she grabbed an empty bottle lying nearby and struck the man on the head. He fell to the ground, and Nicole, not giving herself time to think, hit him repeatedly until he stopped moving. The police, investigating the man's death, found no witnesses or evidence that could lead to Nicole. The murder remained unsolved, which gave her a sense of impunity. With each passing day, Nicole became more aware that she struggled to control her emotions. The memories of the violence and fear she had experienced kept resurfacing. She began to seek out situations where she could release her rage. Her next victim was a man who had been staring at her intently on the bus. His gaze seemed too intrusive and indecent. Nicole got off at the next stop and noticed that the man did too. She followed him into an alley where they were unseen, and there, attacking him from behind, she strangled him with her belt. The police were at a dead end. The victims were not connected. There was no obvious motive, and there was no evidence that could lead to the killer. Despite her dark side, Nicole tried to return to a normal life. One such moment occurred when she ran into her childhood friend, Edward. They bumped into each other on the street by chance, and Edward, a divorced man raising a young daughter, was delighted to see an old friend. He invited her on a date, and Nicole, unexpectedly, agreed. They spent the evening walking through the park and reminiscing about old times. Nicole felt calm and even happy. But when they decided to head home, something inside her went wrong again. Edward wanted to add a bit of romance to their evening and tried to kiss Nicole. At the moment his hands touched her shoulders, she felt a surge of rage once more. Edward became the next victim on Nicole's list. Passers-by found the man and called for an ambulance. He suffered multiple head injuries but was the only survivor thanks to prompt medical attention. In the hospital, once he regained consciousness, he told the police that Nicole was responsible. The next day, the police came to Nicole's home. She tried to deny her guilt, claiming they had simply walked in the park and that Edward had just seen her home. However, the evidence and Edward's testimony were compelling enough. Nicole was taken to the police station for questioning. She was placed in a small room with gray walls where she was to answer the investigators' questions. The detectives leading the case started with simple questions, trying to understand what had happened that night when Edward was found. The detectives asked increasingly probing questions, moving from one topic to another. They mentioned the names of her victims, trying to provoke a reaction from her. Nicole realized she was being cornered. She felt her body tense up again, and images of those nights when she had killed began flashing in her mind. Eventually, she couldn't hold out any longer and confessed. She spoke about each victim, how the men had instilled in her feelings of fear and hatred. She described how every time someone touched her or made inappropriate advances, she was overwhelmed by uncontrollable rage. Nicole recounted how she had killed Carl. She talked about how he had tried to embrace her in the car and how memories of Mr. Harrison had resurfaced. She spoke of her runs, including the time she killed the drunken man on the bench in the park. She remembered every detail, every second of those murders. The detectives listened attentively, recording every word. They understood that they were dealing not just with a killer, but with a person suffering from deep psychological trauma. Nicole continued to describe her actions until she mentioned Edward. She admitted that she had wanted to start a new life, but even a friendly gesture had become a trigger for her, and she had been unable to control herself. After the long interrogation, Nicole was taken back to her cell. Her confessions had become a pivotal moment in the investigation. The detectives now knew what they were dealing with and could begin gathering evidence for the trial. At the trial, the defense attorney sought to prove that Nicole's actions were the result of a mental disorder caused by past abuse. They presented evidence of her trauma, arguing that Nicole needed psychiatric treatment rather than prison time. Forensic experts, psychologists, and psychiatrists testified on behalf of the defense, describing how the trauma Nicole experienced could have impacted her mental state. They argued that she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and other psychological issues that made her actions uncontrollable. Meanwhile, the prosecution insisted that Nicole posed a danger to society. After lengthy proceedings, the court reached a verdict. Nicole was found guilty of a series of murders, but her mental state was also taken into account. The court ruled that instead of incarceration, she would be committed to a psychiatric facility for compulsory treatment. Nicole's current fate remains unknown.